Some knocks on your door have little to no merit. Perhaps it is a neighbor calling. Or a delivery of sorts. But other times, waiting for something to finish, it is a telling moment where a major life crisis could have been averted. Can you recall the moment my grandmother casually recited on the night she wondered? Who really comes and knocks for a helping hand is someone with hidden intentions not to be helped. In the late 1970s, the vicinity of the metropolitan city of Detroit comes to my mind. Notably, the house of my grandparents stood quite a distance from the dirt road and was surrounded with thick greenery and open fields. During the night, my grandpa used to work in an auto factory, so that meant my grandmother had to take care of my 3 kids all alone. At 12 a.m., the doorbell rang. My grandmother went to the living room to have a look and there was no vehicle in the driveway or even the road for that matter. She had a strong instinct telling her that something was off. Instead of unlocking the door, she decided to head upstairs. Stick her head out the window and ask, "What can I do for you today?" A guy happened to be looking there. He told her that a couple miles closer to the road, a car of his had malfunctioned and required the use of a mobile phone. But in reality, the so-called broken-down car was more near to his girlfriend's home as opposed to ours. Why walk half a mile away from resources? Grandma, attempting to comfort him, explained that she could not assist. But he kept begging, his tone raising in urgency. 100% of your text is likely AI generated. New version. Then, she heard it. Fast footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway, emerging from the shadows. A loud crash. Another man stumbled into view from beside the garage. Out of nowhere, a third figure pounced on him. Fists flying in a chaotic blur. The man on the porch whipped around and dashed into the night. The guy on the ground broke free and took off after him. It was only later that Grandma discovered the whole story. While she was chatting with the guy at the door, his partner had been lurking in the dark, waiting for the perfect moment to spring into action. What they didn't realize was that next door, my cousin, a visiting Navy boxing champ, had spotted the 2 men sneaking around. He bolted over, took down the hidden one with a single punch, and put an end to the break-in right then and there. The police never caught the men. But 2 of the guy's teeth are still sitting in a glass bottle at my grandmother's house. Fast forward decades later. Different state. Different house. Different threat. I came home from the movies one night with my wife. Checked the community mailbox. Inside, an Amazon package. And a letter. Typed envelope. My name. No sender, just a return address from the street behind us. The letter read, "We are watching you, Mr. Sex Pervert." With a picture of 2 staring eyes. I was floored. I've never been accused of anything like that in my life. My wife was terrified. We called the sheriff. Minutes home, our car alarm sounded. Then the neighbors. A guy down the block in a black vehicle sat fixed. When he was spotted, he sped off quickly, lights out. The return address did not even exist. If so, it would have been behind our house. And then there's the trip I'll never forget. I was 13, camping with my best friend and his family. Across the lake from our campsite stood an old, sagging cabin. Looked abandoned. We paddled over to explore. Big mistake. Inside, porn magazines, drugs, beer bottles, and 2 loaded shotguns. In one room, headless mannequins wearing wigs. We left fast. That evening, 2 men pulled up to our campsite in a motorboat. Friendly smiles. Then they invited us to hang out at their cabin. The same one we'd just been inside. When my friend's dad refused, the men lingered, drinking. Occasionally asking if just the 2 of us boys could come over. We didn't sleep much that night. In the morning, our trip was cut short. 100% of your text is likely AI generated. New version. And one last story. Back in 2014, I found myself driving through the dark, dense pine woods of Sweden, utterly exhausted. I decided to pull over at a roadside turnout for a quick nap. There were no other cars in sight for miles. I locked the doors, reclined my seat, and soon drifted off to sleep. Suddenly, a blinding light jolted me awake, headlights reflecting in my mirror. A man approached my car and yanked at the back door handle. My horn blared, startling him. I quickly started the car and sped away, glancing back just in time to see 2 more men stepping out of the shadows, one of them wielding something heavy, like a crowbar. They definitely weren't there to help me. Different decades, different places. But the pattern remains the same. A knock at the door, a friendly smile by the campfire. A stranger lurking in the night. It's never just bad luck. It's someone making a choice to target you. So, if your gut ever whispers that something's off, listen to it. Because sometimes, the people who knock aren't there to be welcomed in. I have to start by saying, this is not my tale. It happened to my grandmother in the late 1970s, just outside Detroit, Michigan. She is one of those women who can remember the smallest things from 50 years ago, yesterday. My grandparents were way out in the country at that time, dirt roads, open fields, and clumps of woods interspersed by the occasional farm. Their house was on 10 acres, off the road. My great-grandparents' house was likely 200 feet away. On either side, there was nothing but a half-mile of open fields before you hit the main road. My granddad worked midnights at the motor factory, so evenings it was generally only grandma and the kids at home. One night, around midnight, she was curled up in the lounge watching telly when there was a knock on the front door. Now, she was a sharp one, the kind of woman who'd notice if a shadow crossed the wrong way. So before she opened anything, she peered out of the upstairs bedroom window, which overlooked the front porch. Under the light of the moon, she noticed a man standing there, but no car. Not in the driveway. Not on the road. When she asked him what he was doing there, he told her that his car had stopped working and he needed to call for assistance. Claimed that he was on his way to his girlfriend's place, which was supposedly just around the corner. Other than that, the location where he claimed his car had broken down was closer to my girlfriend's house than my grandparents'. If so, then he would have had nothing to do with going half a mile in the other direction. Grandma told him she couldn't help. That's when his tone changed, pleading at first, then more insistent. "Please," he said. "Just let me use the phone. I'll be gone in a minute." And that's when it happened. From somewhere off to the side, in the darkness near the garage, she heard fast footsteps on gravel, followed by a loud crash. The second man had rushed forward, but instead of landing on the porch, he crashed to the ground. The man in the doorway braced himself, then took off into the darkness. The man on the ground scrambled to his feet, and that was when Grandma realized why. And above him was my cousin, the Navy boxing champion, stopping by my great-grandparents' place next door. He sat at their kitchen table when he noticed two men approaching my grandparents' house. One stood in the open, knocking. The other was lying flat against the wall beside the garage, hiding. Cousin did not have time to wait and see what would occur. He sprinted full tilt through the yard, tacked the hidden man and started pummeling his face in. The brawl was only seconds long. The man slipped loose, teeth missing, and fled into the evening with his partner. The police came, but never apprehended them. My grandmother retains those two teeth in a tiny glass vial to this day. I wish I could say creepy strangers at the door ended with my grandmother's generation, but cut to last year, and it happened to me. My wife and I live in a suburban, middle-class neighborhood. One of those cookie-cutter complexes with no mailboxes out front. Instead, there's a clump at the end of the street. One night, I went out to retrieve the mail and found a little package from Amazon that I had been waiting for, and a bland envelope with my name. No return name, just an address from the back of our street. Inside the envelope was a note that read, "We are watching you, Mr. Sex Pervert." And a paper copy of two creepy, black and white eyes. Nothing like that was ever done to me in my life. Faithfully married, lifeless even. But this. It shook me up. We called the sheriff's office. They told us that it was out of the ordinary, but short of more, they could do nothing about it. 5 minutes later, our car alarm was set off. So was my neighbor's. Another neighbor spotted a black car parked outside his house, no lights, and, when he stepped outside, the driver speedily sped away. The police came back, picked up the letter as proof, but again, nothing. And ever since, my wife starts in fright every time the dogs howl at night. It puts you in mind, how often does undesirable folk come straight to your door? And you never even suspect. My grandmother never opened hers. Which is why she's here to share the story. Have to start by saying, this isn't my story. My grandmother told it to me, and she's one of those people who can tell you something that happened 50 years ago like it was last night. This happened in the late 1970s, near Detroit, back when my grandparents' house was out in the middle of nowhere. They had a dirt road to their house, with fields and woods surrounding them. No streetlights, no cars driving by, just darkness. They lived on 10 acres, set back from the road, with my great-grandparents' house about 200 feet away. To either side. A half-mile of nothing until you hit a main road. My grandfather worked midnights at the car factory, so one night, my grandmother was alone, in the living room, watching TV. It was near 11:30 when she heard a knock at the front door. Something didn't feel right. She looked out the window, there was no car in the driveway, none in the street. Instead of going to the door, she went upstairs to their bedroom window, which overlooked the front steps. She looked down and saw a man standing there. He waved to her, explained that his car had given out down the road, and asked if he could use the phone. He claimed he was on his way to his girlfriend's house, just up at the corner. But here's the thing, where he claimed the car had broken down, he would have been closer to her house than his girlfriend's. So why walk half a mile away from where you're going? She told him she couldn't help. The man got agitated, pleading with her to just let him in, promising he'd leave right after. Then, she heard it. Quick footsteps crunching across the gravel driveway, and out of the darkness along the garage, a second man leaped into view, only to be tackled to the ground by another. As it happened, my cousin was visiting next door. He'd been in the kitchen at my great-grandma's house and had seen two men approach, one hide in the darkness along the garage while the other knocked at the door. My cousin, the Navy boxing champion at the time, sprinted over and blindsided the one hiding. The one on the porch took off running. The one on the ground got free and ran after him. The police never caught them. But they did find some evidence, 2 teeth, loosened and left in the dirt. My grandma kept them in a little glass bottle, to this day. Flash forward to the present, new home, new people. A man and his wife come home from a film one night. They stop at the group of mailboxes in their subdivision to retrieve a package. Inside was a plain white envelope with his name typed on the front but no sender, just a return address from a street behind theirs. What was inside? A piece of paper with the following note. "We are watching you, Mr. Sex Pervert." And below the words, 2 crudely drawn, staring eyes. The address didn't exist, house numbers on that street skipped right over it. If it had existed, it would have been directly behind their backyard. 5 minutes after they got home, their car alarm started shrieking, and wouldn't stop. Turns out, their neighbor's car alarm went off at the exact same time. A neighbor stepped out to take a glance, only to see a man sitting in a black car with the lights off. When spotted, the men drove away, lights still off. The police came, took the letter, but didn't have much to go on. Sleep was not forthcoming that night. And then there's the following. 2 boys, maybe 13, go camping with a friend's dad and uncles. They canoe across a lake to explore an abandoned cabin, only to find it wasn't so abandoned after all. Inside, beer bottles, drugs, 2 shotguns, and a back room full of mannequins. Not store mannequins, these were sporting wigs, all different colors, but no clothes. The air inside felt off. They left in a hurry. That night, 2 men in a motorboat visited their campsite, drinking, leering, asking the boys to come hang out at their cabin. Said Pat's dad, no. The men lingered until dark before they departed. The trip was canceled the next morning without discussion. Sometimes, though, danger finds you. A woman walking 3 little dogs in a quiet park notices a man approaching her, no dogs with him, just a slip lead in his pocket. He brags about trying to socialize some other woman's fearful dog the day before, by putting the slip lead on it without asking. The kind of lead that tightens like a noose. One of her dogs growls, something it never does. She lies, says her dad is waiting in the car, and leaves. When she looks back, he is still watching her. I could continue, the date that turned into a 3-hour hostage-like car ride with a guy who admitted to hitting animals when he was upset. The middle school girl stalked for months by a Starbucks barista who obtained her name from a teacher. Or the man who woke up in his car at a rest area to find someone trying to pry open his back door, 2 more standing just behind. The truth is, these aren't random events. Sometimes evil knocks politely. Sometimes it lurks in the dark. Sometimes it's the vehicle following you with its lights off. And sometimes, as with my grandmother's night in 1970s Detroit, it's standing on your porch. And it's not alone. A few months after my grandmother's encounter in the 70s, my grandfather could have sworn he saw someone skulking and watching the house from the tree line. It was 3 a.m., and he was pulling into the driveway from his shift at the car factory. The headlights lit up the front of the house, and there they were, 2 gleaming eyes looking back from the darkness near the woods. They didn't blink. They didn't move. When he got out of the car, the air was too still, like the crickets had suddenly all stopped at once. He yelled into the trees, and the eyes shifted some, and stood up. It wasn't an animal. It was a man. Tall. Thin. In something light-colored that caught the headlights when he moved. And then, he just backed into the trees until he was gone. My grandfather searched with a flashlight for 20 minutes. He found nothing. No trail. No sound of cracking twigs. Just gone. Decades later, something eerily similar happened to me. I was house-sitting for a friend in a suburban area, just me and their German shepherd. At midnight, the dog started pacing, whining towards the back door. When I went to look outside, I saw someone standing in the yard. At first, I thought it was a shadow from the trees, till it moved, stepping forward, slowly, like they were trying not to be seen. The dog was growling, ears back, tail stiff. I switched on the floodlights. The yard was lit. And there was no one there. Except, there were new footprints in the frost. Bare feet. Another thing happened to my uncle in the late 80s. He was driving home after midnight when he noticed a car parked on the side of the road with its hazard lights on. He figured that someone might need help, so he slowed down and lowered his window to ask. The man standing next to the car did not answer. He just stared. My uncle noticed two things. The man's hands were behind his back. And there were two other guys crouched down on the passenger side, trying to stay concealed. My uncle didn't waste any time. He gunned it and took off. When he checked the rear view, the disabled car made a U-turn and started to follow him, lights off. He was able to make it home, but didn't turn into the driveway. He kept going, drove around the block, and finally lost them. For a week afterward, he swore he noticed the same vehicle parked in different places around town. And then there's the one that still sends shivers down my spine. Because it didn't happen in the woods or on a deserted road. It happened inside. A single mom of two who was a friend of the family woke up in the dead of night to the sound of breathing. Not down the hallway. Not outside the window. In her bedroom. She stopped, listening, attempting to persuade herself that it was only the house creaking. Then she heard it again, slow, ponderous, intentional breaths, beside her bed. She stretched for the lamp and switched it on. There was no one. But the closet door, which she always left closed, stood wide open. You know how sometimes the thing that's most scary isn't necessarily what you can see, it's what's just beyond your view. This story isn't mine. It's my grandmother's. And if you'd known her, you'd know she's got one of those minds like a trap made of steel. You can ask her what she had for breakfast 50 years prior and she'll recite it. It took place in the late 1970s, on the outskirts of Detroit. My grandparents were living there back then, deep in what you'd call the boonies of the day, a dirt road, fields, and heavy woods all around them. Their home was very back from the road, 10 open acres. My great-grandparents lived next door to them, right next door, some 200 feet away, to the right. Half a mile of open fields on either side of their place. That's before you got to the main road. It was quiet. The kind of quiet where you could actually hear your own heartbeat. One night, around midnight, Grandma was alone in front of the TV. Grandpa was on the midnight shift at the car plant, and the kids were all asleep upstairs. That is when she heard it, a knock on the front door. Now, out there, in the middle of nowhere, a knock that late wasn't friendly neighbor territory. It was the kind of thing that paralyzed you before you moved. She peered from behind the upstairs bedroom window facing the front step. No car in the driveway. Northwest lights along the road. Just a man, standing at the door, looking up. He called her up, said his car had broken down, and he needed to use her phone. Pretended his girlfriend lived, just up at the corner. Thing is, Grandma knew that corner. If his car broke down where he said it did, he'd been closer to his girlfriend's than his. So why did he take a half mile in the opposite direction? She told him, firmly, "Sorry, I can't help you." That's when his voice cracked. From polite to pleading. Then, almost enraged. And that's when Grandma heard the noise, pounding footsteps crunching over gravel from the darkness by the garage. A second man burst out of the shadows, only he didn't make it far. He was knocked to the ground by someone who started raining blows on him. The man on the porch spun around and fled into the night. The man on the sidewalk managed to escape and set off after him. As it turned out, meanwhile, his buddy was hiding behind the garage, hoping for her to open the door so that they could burst in. What they didn't know was my cousin, who had come to see my great-grandma next door, had been sitting by the kitchen window. He saw them approaching, saw one get into cover, and without breaking stride, ran across the yard and took the guy out like a bag of bricks. Oh, and my cousin. The Navy boxing champion. Police were called. The men were never caught, but Grandma still keeps the souvenir they left behind, 2 teeth, in a little glass jar. Fast forward a couple decades, and the family's luck with creepy encounters still going strong. A guy I'll call Mike was living in a new, quiet neighborhood. Nice place. Safe. Or so he thought. He went to retrieve a package one night at the neighborhood mailbox. There was an unmarked envelope with his name on it, but no address to return it to, only a street name behind his home. He opened it, his stomach dropping. There was a letter. "We are watching you, Mr. Sex Pervert." And a printed photo of a pair of gaping eyes. Mike was not a pervert. Never. But now, he and his wife were angry. They phoned the sheriff. Officers indicated they would send somebody, but could not promise when. Minutes after they got back home, their car alarm and the neighbors were going off together. Another neighbor had noticed a black car parked out front with lights out and a fellow inside. When he went out, the car took off without engaging its headlights. And the return address? There wasn't one. It's news like this that makes you realize danger doesn't always signal itself. Occasionally it's standing outside your door, expecting to use the phone. Occasionally it's lurking in the darkness, watching. And sometimes, you don't even realize it's there, at all, until it's too late. That's why my grandmother always cautions. If there is a knock that late at night, and you're home by yourself, do not open the door. Because the worst part? You may not be talking to the sole one who showed up. You ever hear a story that leaves you wondering how secure your own home really is? This one's been around my family for decades. It's told so many times it borders on campfire tale status, except it really did happen. And if you ever meet my grandmother, you'd see she doesn't exaggerate. We're traveling back to the late 1970s, on the outskirts of Detroit. Where I'm from, my grandparents' place was. Well, the term remote doesn't even start to cover it. Dirt road. Acres of empty fields. Dark, thick forests on 3 sides. Their house back far from the road, no streetlights to be seen. The kind of quiet where you could hear a twig break at 50 yards out. My great-grandparents' home was maybe 200 feet away. Then there was just land and nothing. It was a weeknight. My grandfather was on the midnight shift at the factory, so Grandma was home alone in the house with the children, who were all in bed in their bedrooms upstairs. She was in the living room, in front of the TV, when she heard it. A knock. Slow. Heavy. She froze for a moment, then crept automatically to the window above the front door. What she saw made her skin crawl. There was a man outside, looking up at her. Not out in the yard, not on the ground, straight up to her window, like he thought he would find her there. He shouted up, said his car had broken down and he needed to call for a tow truck on her phone. Mentioned his girlfriend lived just up at the corner. But Grandma was familiar with that corner. If his car had lost its way at the place he said, his girlfriend's apartment would have been closer than hers. So why come all the way to her door? She told him through the glass, "Sorry, I can't help you." That's when his tone shifted. From courteous to pleading. Then low. Hard. Almost angry. And just as she was thinking of stepping away from the window, she heard it. Crunching of gravel. Footsteps. Coming around from the back of the house. Another fellow. Emerging out of the dark by the garage, sprinting away. Before he could get to the porch, a flash shot out of the night. My cousin, stopped by my great-grandma at home, was sitting by her kitchen window and witnessed it all. He sprinted across the lawn, headlong, and knocked the guy to the ground. The porchman spun around and took off into the darkness. The groundman squirmed loose and took off after him, both disappearing into the dark tree line. Later did they realize, the driver left stranded on the road wasn't merely begging for help. The individual standing by the door was the distraction. The individual by the garage was the true danger, waiting until she opened the door. The police came by, but the men were never found. My cousin swore the guy's teeth broke on his fist, and Grandma still keeps those 2 teeth in a tiny glass jar. Years later, many years after my grandparents moved away, my family thought that night was a strange, isolated incident. But trouble has a way of returning to you. One summer, a friend of my family, let's say his name was Mike, rented a house in a residential suburban area not too far from where my grandparents once resided. It was the sort of neighborhood where individuals would leave bikes in the yard and doors unlocked during the day. Mike went out one evening to the community mailbox to retrieve that night's mail. Along with a small package, he found an envelope with no name on it but only his name on it. No return name, just a typed return address from a street located behind his residence. Upon his arrival home and opening of the same, his stomach turned. There was a letter. "We are watching you, Mr. Sex Pervert." And a photo, just a couple of eyes looking dead into the camera. Mike wasn't like the note read, but the words stung. He showed it to his wife, and she ordered him immediately to call the sheriff. They said they'd send somebody to take a report. Eventually. In minutes of him hanging up the phone, his car alarm and the neighbor's alarm began blaring, at the same time. The cacophony echoed down the block. One of the neighbors stepped outside and noticed a black sedan at the curb with its headlights turned off. A man was sitting behind the wheel. When the neighbor started walking towards it, the car slowly moved away without turning on its headlights. The second day, Mike glanced at the return address label on the envelope. It didn't exist. Not even close. And here's the part that still annoys me. A month after that, Mike's wife found something strange in their driveway, a small glass jar. What was in it? 2 human teeth. She turned to Mike and asked if he'd ever noticed them before, and he went white. He remembered a story he'd heard at a barbecue many years before, about a woman alone in her house, 2 men at the door, and a cousin who'd fought one of them off, bad enough to loosen his teeth. The cops took the jar, but nothing ever came of it. Sometimes the threat isn't in the moment, it's in what lingers after. The guys who showed up at my grandmother's front door. Never caught. The people on Mike's lawn. Never caught. And maybe that's the scariest thing. Because if they still have a reason to knock, some night, you might be the one to answer. You see, people always imagine horror stories happening in big cities, dark alleys, rough neighborhoods. But sometimes, the most horrific events happen in the middle of nowhere. No one to hear you scream. No one to call for help. Just you and whatever is outside. This story is not mine. It's my grandmother's. And if you knew her, you'd understand, she doesn't make up tales. She's got a memory like a steel trap. She can tell you what she ate for breakfast on a Tuesday morning in 1974. This happened in the late 1970s, in what was at the time the outskirts of Detroit. My grandparents were way down a dirt road in those days. No streetlights. No neighbors within shouting distance, unless you wanted to include my great-grandparents, who lived perhaps 200 feet away, across an open yard. Beyond that, nothing but miles of open fields, thick woods, and a whole lot of darkness. It was the kind of quiet where you could hear your own heartbeat. The knock. One night, late, close to midnight, Grandma was by herself at home. Grandpa worked the midnight shift at the car factory, and the kids were already asleep upstairs. She was watching TV, half asleep, when she heard it. Knock knock knock, at the front door. Now, out there, a late-night knock wasn't friendly. It wasn't neighborly. You froze before you opened the door. She got up slowly, not making a noise. The front door did not have a peephole, so she crept up to the spare bedroom window, which had a clear view of the porch. No car in the driveway. No headlights coming down the road. Just a man, standing there. Staring up at her window. The stranger's story. He called up to her. Said his car had broken down. Told her his girlfriend's house was just up at the corner, and he needed to use the phone. Thing was, Grandma knew that corner. If his car really broke down where he claimed, he would have been closer to his girlfriend's house than hers. So why walk half a mile in the opposite direction? Her instincts told her something was not right. She called back through the closed window, "Sorry, I can't help you." The change. That's when his voice changed. From polite to pleading. Then from pleading to annoyed. And that's when Grandma heard something else. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Fast footsteps on gravel. Coming from the side of the house. A second man burst out of the darkness near the garage. Only he didn't get far. The tackle. Out of nowhere, another man ran across the yard. He tackled the second man so forcefully they fell into the dirt. The man on the porch turned and ran off into the dark. The one on the ground freed himself and ran after him. What had happened to be was that while Grandma was there talking to the men at the door, his accomplice was hiding by the garage, waiting for her to open it so they could rush in. What they didn't know. My cousin, who was home visiting my great-grandma, was in the kitchen, sipping coffee, and saw the whole thing go down through the window. And my cousin. Navy boxing champion. He didn't even think twice, he just ran at full speed and tackled the men. The aftermath. Police came. Looked for the men. Never found them. The only thing they left behind. 2 of their teeth, knocked fully out, which my grandma still keeps in a little jar. She calls it her souvenir. But here's the thing. That wasn't the last time something like that happened to our family. The letter. Years later, one of our family members, a guy named Mike, moved into a quiet, decent neighborhood. One evening, he walked down the street to retrieve the mail from the communal box. Among the bills was an unmarked envelope. No return name, just a return address from a street behind his. He opened it and his gut turned to ice. Inside was a note. "We are watching you, Mr. Sex Pervert." And a printed picture of a pair of eyes, staring straight at him. Mike was none of those things that note claimed. But now he and his wife felt violated. They called the sheriff. Deputies said they'd send someone by when they could. The black car. Within minutes of their arrival home, both their car alarm and that of their neighbor sounded simultaneously. A neighbor peeked outside and spotted a black car parked in front of Mike's house. Lights off. Someone inside. When he stepped out onto the porch, the car pulled away, no headlights, vanishing down the street. The return address on the envelope didn't even exist. The unsettling truth. Here's what I've learned from growing up in this family. Danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it's standing on your porch, asking to use the phone. Sometimes it's waiting in the dark, parked for you. And sometimes you don't even notice it until it's too near. And my grandmother, she still says the same thing every time she tells this story. If someone knocks that late at night, and you're home alone, never answer the door. Because the scariest thing, you might not be talking to the only one who stopped over. I must start by saying, this story was passed straight down to me from my grandmother. She possesses a type of memory where she can remember what she had for breakfast in 1973 and also remember the color of the plate correctly. It happened during the late 1970s, on the outskirts of Detroit. Back then, my grandparents lived in what you'd call the boonies, miles of dirt roads, fields, and deep patches of woods. Their house sat on 10 acres, tucked far back from the road, and just a couple 100 feet away was my great-grandparents' place. Beyond that, it was nothing but silence and farmland. My grandfather had the midnight shift at the car factory, and my grandma stayed home with the 3 kids. At midnight, she hears a knock on the front door. She's playing it cautious now. First thing, she looks out the front window, no car on the driveway, nothing on the road. Just the silver-blue moonlight across empty fields. Instead of heading for the door, she steps into the bedroom window, one that is facing the porch. That is where she sees him, a man, in the light on the porch, with his head raised. He shouts up to her that his vehicle has broken down farther up the road and he just wants to call her number. Informs her that he is going to his girlfriend's home right up at the corner. But the point is, if his story was true, his girlfriend's house would have been only 100 or 200 yards away, and he'd walked half a mile in the opposite direction. Grandma says no to him, that she can't assist. That's when his attitude changes, whining now, saying it'll take only a minute. And then, out of the darkness, she hears it. Sprint of feet on the gravel drive. Then a loud thud as another man crashes out from behind the garage. The man on the porch spins around and runs off into the night. The man who crashed to the ground is now being beaten by a third figure, fists pounding down hard. Grandma has no idea what's going on, until she finds out. While she was talking to the man on the porch, his partner in crime had been lurking around the house, waiting for the door to be opened. What they didn't realize was that my cousin had stopped at my great-grandma's house next door. He'd been sitting in the kitchen table and saw the 2 men approaching. He observed one take his position and watched the other bang on the door. And my cousin, a champion boxer for the Navy's Pacific Fleet, took off running full speed, tackled the man hiding, and knocked him to the ground. By the time the brawl was dispersed, both men had vanished among the fields. The police never managed to track them down, but they did discover something in the driveway. 2 human teeth, which my grandma still maintains in a little glass bottle. This is where other people's stories would end. But this is where mine starts. My wife and I went to the movies a few weeks ago, got home at 9. We hadn't left one of those safe, suburban streets where all the mailboxes are concentrated at the end of the street. I had a package to receive, and a white envelope with no return name but my name typed out on it. No return name, just an address off the street running behind our house. We didn't know anyone there, but I opened it. There was a single sheet of paper with a sketch of 2 eyes, and the following letter. "We are watching you, Mr. Sex Pervert." I thought the air had been sucked out of my lungs. I've never had anyone accuse me of anything my entire life. My wife knows me, she trusts me. But she was angry, and made me call the sheriff. While we were waiting for a deputy to show up, something more strange happened. Our car alarm started going off, so did my neighbors. We soon discovered that there was a man sitting in a black car across the street with his lights off. When our neighbor went out to look, the man sped away with no headlights. Here's the kicker, the return address on the letter. There isn't any such house. The number is left off the street. If there were one, it would be directly behind our backyard. And yet, that wasn't even the scariest moment of my life. Because I was a teenager, and I camped with my best friend. Across the lake from our campsite was what looked like an abandoned cabin, overgrown, drooping roof. While the adults were busy drinking and fishing, we paddled by in a canoe to check what we could see. The front door was ajar. Inside, not at all deserted. Pornographic publications on the table, beer, drugs, and 2 hunting rifles against the wall. One room locked us up. Dozens of store mannequins, all nude, with nothing on but wigs. Different lengths, different colors. Not a piece of clothing anywhere to be seen. Stale air, as though something was brewing. We cut back around the lake and informed my friend's father. That night, 2 men in a motorboat drove by our campfire. Friendly enough at first, until they invited just the guys to come on back to their cabin and hang out. His father wrapped us in his arms all night long, fire burning, watchful eyes on the dark water. The next morning, we packed up and left without a word. And year after year, the pattern went on. The man in the park with no dog, holding a slip lead. The not stranger on the online dating site who asked me to meet him at midnight in the empty cliffside park. The Starbucks-clad man who persisted in offering a 12-year-old girl free drinks and memorizing her schedule. The 3 figures who tried to break into an open car on the middle of a dark Swedish road. Different places. Different people. Same feeling. That icy sensation that whispers to you. Don't open the door. Don't get in the car. Don't go inside. Because every single time, behind the knock, behind the smile, there's someone waiting. And they're never alone. Following that frightening night on the dirt road, after the teeth and the men running vanished into the darkness, something in my grandmother's neighborhood changed. It was subtle at first, a look from a shadow just beyond a window, a low noise at night that could not be accounted for. She explained to me once how her dog would abruptly cease barking and become eerily still, fixating on something or nothing. The sort of stillness that makes your flesh creep. The men never returned to their home, or at least not in a form she witnessed. But she always had the sense that they never left. Years later, my wife and I were settled in our safe neighborhood, but I could not shake the feeling of that letter, "We are watching you." I could not help but ask myself, who would do such a thing? What did they want? And how much did they really know about me? I began to take notice. Lights flickering off. Shadows darting just out of vision. The sensation that each time I glanced in the window, I caught a glimpse of someone standing just behind the shrubs. One evening, 2 weeks or so after the letter, my wife and I both heard something at the rear door, a gentle tapping, as if someone were knocking softly. I looked through the window but didn't see anything. No footprints in the dirt. No headlights, no vehicle. Nothing but quiet. The sensation of being watched washed over me like a wave. That night, I stayed awake attempting to figure it out. My mind flashed back to tales I'd learned as a child, cautionary stories told by relatives concerning strangers who didn't travel solo. Who lingered in the dark, observing homes, learning patterns. I realized, this wasn't coincidence. Somebody was watching us. Somebody knew when we went out, when we came back home, when we were alone. The next morning, I had a talk with my neighbor, a retired policeman with a keen eye and a calm voice. Ever feel like someone's been around when you're not home? I asked him. He slowly nodded. That kind of stalking, it escalates if you ignore it. You've got to catch it early, make noise, set traps. Cameras. Lights on timers. Make it clear you see them. I bought security cameras and motion detectors. Put up floodlights on timers. Had lights turn on at random times every night. I kept the phone close. And still, every time I looked outside, I felt eyes on me. One night, I even caught something on camera. A dark figure, stooping behind the neighbor's fence, just watching. I brought the video to the sheriff's department. They told me they would increase patrols, but I knew this was no ordinary intruder. It was personal. The feeling followed me everywhere. It's just like that camping excursion I did when I was a kid. Remember the cabin by the lake? The one with mannequins. Well, years later, I met an old man at a gas station who claimed he'd lived near that cabin once. He told me rumors, stories the locals whispered, of a man who disappeared after years of dwelling out there. Some said he was a madman. Others said worse. The mannequins. They were his means of pretending he wasn't alone. He told me that sometimes, late at night, if you paid attention, you could hear footsteps in the trees, not animals, but somebody pacing, observing. I knew the danger I'd just missed that day. The old man looked me straight in the eye and said to me, "People like that don't disappear. They wait. They watch. And every now and then, they come knocking." Back in my neighborhood, things escalated. One evening, the security cameras detected motion, a person strolling slowly along the street, hands in pockets, head lowered. The motion sensors triggered floodlights that blasted into the street, but the figure vanished before police arrived. I have no idea how they got here so fast or where they disappeared. Then one night, the car alarms began blaring again. Not just mine and my neighbors this time, several cars up and down the street. Lights flickered. Phones buzzed. One neighbor did catch a glimpse of a person darting between parked vehicles, a shadowy figure fleeing into the darkness. The police had no leads. No faces. No license plates. No fingerprints. Merely a threat looming over us like a storm cloud. I began to wonder whether it was a game for them. A test. To see how far they could push, how much terror they could instill before getting caught. And the strangest part? Even though I was terrified, I couldn't look away. There's something about being hunted that claws into your mind. Something primal. One morning, I found a note slipped under my door. This one was different. No threats. Only 2 little words. "You're next." After that, I felt like I was walking on glass. Every shadow, every knock, every stray sound was a countdown. So here's what I want to tell you. And if you do get that knock in the dead of night and the story doesn't add up, if the person on your porch cannot tell you why they're there, trust your instincts. For sometimes, when they knock, they're not alone. Following that frightening night on the dirt road, after the teeth and the men running vanished into the darkness, something in my grandmother's neighborhood changed. It was subtle at first, a look from a shadow just beyond a window, a low noise at night that could not be accounted for. She explained to me once how her dog would abruptly cease barking and become eerily still, fixating on something or nothing. The sort of stillness that makes your flesh creep. The men never returned to their home, or at least not in a form she witnessed. But she always had the sense that they never left. Years later, my wife and I were settled in our safe neighborhood, but I could not shake the feeling of that letter, "We are watching you." I could not help but ask myself, who would do such a thing? What did they want? And how much did they really know about me? I began to take notice. Lights flickering off. Shadows darting just out of vision. The sensation that each time I glanced in the window, I caught a glimpse of someone standing just behind the shrubs. One evening, 2 weeks or so after the letter, my wife and I both heard something at the rear door, a gentle tapping, as if someone were knocking softly. I looked through the window but didn't see anything. No footprints in the dirt. No headlights, no vehicle. Nothing but quiet. The sensation of being watched washed over me like a wave. That night, I stayed awake attempting to figure it out. My mind flashed back to tales I'd learned as a child, cautionary stories told by relatives concerning strangers who didn't travel solo. Who lingered in the dark, observing homes, learning patterns. I realized, this wasn't coincidence. Somebody was watching us. Somebody knew when we went out, when we came back home, when we were alone. The next morning, I had a talk with my neighbor, a retired policeman with a keen eye and a calm voice. Ever feel like someone's been around when you're not home? I asked him. He slowly nodded. That kind of stalking, it escalates if you ignore it. You've got to catch it early, make noise, set traps. Cameras. Lights on timers. Make it clear you see them. I bought security cameras and motion detectors. Put up floodlights on timers. Had lights turn on at random times every night. I kept the phone close. And still, every time I looked outside, I felt eyes on me. One night, I even caught something on camera. A dark figure, stooping behind the neighbor's fence, just watching. I brought the video to the sheriff's department. They told me they would increase patrols, but I knew this was no ordinary intruder. It was personal. The feeling followed me everywhere. It's just like that camping excursion I did when I was a kid, remember the cabin by the lake? The one with mannequins. Well, years later, I met an old man at a gas station who claimed he'd lived near that cabin once. He told me rumors, stories the locals whispered, of a man who disappeared after years of dwelling out there. Some said he was a madman. Others said worse. The mannequins. They were his means of pretending he wasn't alone. He told me that sometimes, late at night, if you paid attention, you could hear footsteps in the trees, not animals, but somebody pacing, observing. I knew the danger I'd just missed that day. The old man looked me straight in the eye and said to me, "People like that don't disappear. They wait. They watch. And every now and then, they come knocking." Back in my neighborhood, things escalated. One evening, the security cameras detected motion, a person strolling slowly along the street, hands in pockets, head lowered. The motion sensors triggered floodlights that blasted into the street, but the figure vanished before police arrived. I have no idea how they got here so fast or where they disappeared. Then one night, the car alarms began blaring again. Not just mine and my neighbors this time, several cars up and down the street. Lights flickered. Phones buzzed. One neighbor did catch a glimpse of a person darting between parked vehicles, a shadowy figure fleeing into the darkness. The police had no leads. No faces. No license plates. No fingerprints. Merely a threat looming over us like a storm cloud. I began to wonder whether it was a game for them. A test. To see how far they could push, how much terror they could instill before getting caught. And the strangest part? Even though I was terrified, I couldn't look away. There's something about being hunted that claws into your mind. Something primal. One morning, I found a note slipped under my door. This one was different. No threats. Only two little words. "You're next." After that, I felt like I was walking on glass. Every shadow, every knock, every stray sound was a countdown. So here's what I want to tell you. And if you do get that knock in the dead of night and the story doesn't add up, if the person on your porch cannot tell you why they're there, trust your instincts. For sometimes, when they knock, they're not alone. I have to start by saying, this story isn't mine. It happened to my grandmother, back in the late 1970s, just outside Detroit, Michigan. She's the kind of woman who can remember the smallest details from 50 years ago like they happened yesterday. And believe me, this is one detail she'll never forget. My grandparents lived way out in what was considered the boonies at the time, dirt roads, endless fields, clumps of woods, and just a few farms scattered around. Their house sat on 10 acres, tucked back from the road. My great-grandparents lived about 200 feet away, and to either side of their property, it was just open fields all the way to the main road. It was quiet. Isolated. The kind of place where, if you heard a knock at your door after dark, you really noticed it. One night, my grandfather was working the midnight shift at the auto plant, leaving my grandma home alone with their 3 kids asleep upstairs. Around 11:30, she hears a knock at the door. Now, this is before cell phones or doorbell cameras, and their driveway was long enough that you couldn't hear someone pulling in. She peeks through the front window. In the moonlight, no car. Not in the driveway, not on the road. She doesn't go to the door. Instead, she goes upstairs to the bedroom window that overlooks the front step. And there's a man, just standing there, looking up. He says his car broke down and asks to use the phone. Says he was heading to his girlfriend's house, up at the corner. Problem was, if his car really broke down where he claimed, his girlfriend's house would have been closer than my grandparents'. Why walk half a mile away from her, into the dark, to knock on a stranger's door? She tells him she can't help. He starts pleading. Getting agitated. Says he just needs to use the phone and he'll be on his way. And then, my grandma hears it. Fast footsteps on gravel, moving fast, from somewhere in the darkness beside the garage. Then, a crash. A second man comes flying out from the shadows and hits the ground hard. The man on the porch freezes, then bolts into the night. Turns out, while she'd been talking to the guy at the door, his buddy had been pressed flat against the side of the house, ready to rush in if she opened it. But my cousin, who happened to be visiting my great-grandparents next door, had been watching. He'd seen both men sneak up. And my cousin. He was a Navy Pacific Fleet boxing champion. He sprinted over and tackled the hidden man, landing punch after punch until the guy managed to wriggle free and run. Police never caught them. But my grandma still has a souvenir from that night, 2 teeth they found on the driveway, kept in a little glass bottle. That story always stuck with me, but years later, I found myself in a situation that made my blood run cold in a different way. My wife and I live in a quiet, middle-class neighborhood. No crime, no trouble. One evening, we picked up an Amazon package from the community mailbox, and found a letter addressed to me. The return address? A street directly behind ours, except the house number didn't exist. I opened it. Inside was a piece of paper with 2 crude, printed eyes, and the words, "We are watching you, Mr. Sex Pervert." I was stunned. I've never done anything remotely like what that letter implied. No accusations, no enemies, nothing. My wife was shaken, so I called the sheriff's department. 5 minutes after we got home, my car alarm starts blaring. I thought maybe I hit the panic button, but the key fob wouldn't turn it off. My wife shut it off with hers. Then we hear our neighbor's car alarm going off. Another neighbor comes outside, says he saw a man in a black car parked between our houses. When the neighbor came out, the guy drove off, without turning on his headlights. Police came. Took the letter. But they didn't have much to go on. And I didn't sleep that night. A while later, I learned the hard way, sometimes danger doesn't knock, or send a letter. Sometimes it hides, waiting. When I was 13, I went on a camping trip with a friend, his dad, and some uncles. Our site was across the lake from what looked like an old abandoned cabin. Roof sagging, brush overgrown. The adults let us take a canoe over to explore. Inside, it wasn't abandoned. It was lived in. Porn magazines on the table. Beer bottles. Weed. 2 shotguns on a shelf. And in one back room, headless mannequins wearing wigs. We left quickly and told my friend's dad. That night, 2 men in a motorboat stopped by our campfire. They were the friendly, kind of drunk, but kept inviting my friend and me to come to their cabin. His dad refused, but stayed up all night by the fire. We packed up early the next morning and left without fishing. All these years, I keep thinking about one thing. Whether it's a stranger at your door, a creepy note, or an abandoned cabin across the water. It's never just what you see. It's what, or who, you don't. I need to start by saying, this isn't my story. It happened to my grandmother back in the late 1970s, just outside Detroit, Michigan. She's the kind of woman who can remember what she wore to the grocery store 40 years ago, and tell it to you like it happened this morning. Back then, my grandparents lived way out in the country. Dirt roads, open fields, patches of dark woods, and the occasional farm. Their house sat back off the road on 10 acres, and just about 200 feet away was my great-grandparents' place. Between them and the nearest main road, a half-mile of empty land. My grandpa worked the night shift at an auto plant, so most nights, Grandma was home alone with their 3 kids. One night, around 11, she was sitting in the living room watching TV when she heard a knock at the door. Not loud. Not frantic. Just deliberate. She peeked out the front window, and in the pale moonlight, she noticed something strange. No car in the driveway. Northwest lights on the road. Just a man standing at her front door. Now, Grandma was smart. Instead of opening the door, she went upstairs to the bedroom window, right above the porch, and leaned out. "What do you need?" she called down. The man said his car broke down up the road and he needed to use her phone. He claimed he was heading to his girlfriend's place just around the corner. But here's the thing, if his car broke down where he said it did, his girlfriend's house would have been closer than my grandparents'. Instead of walking a couple hundred yards toward her, he walked a half-mile away from her. Grandma told him she couldn't help and that he needed to move along. That's when his tone shifted. Pleading. Then almost angry. Please, I'll just use the phone and be on my way. While she was telling him to leave, she suddenly heard it, fast footsteps crunching through gravel, coming from the darkness beside the garage. Then, bam, a second man came flying into view, crashing to the ground. And on top of him, a third man, beating the life out of him with both fists. The guy on the porch spun around and bolted into the night. The men getting pummeled managed to scramble up and take off after him. Turns out, while Grandma was talking to the guy on the porch, his buddy was pressed flat against the side of the house, waiting for her to open the door so they could both force their way in. What they didn't know was that my cousin was visiting next door. He happened to glance out the kitchen window at the exact moment the two strangers walked up. He saw one hide in the shadows by the garage while the other knocked. My cousin, a Navy boxing champion at the time, charged across the yard and blindsided the men hiding by the garage. Two teeth hit the ground. Grandma actually kept them in a little glass bottle for years. The police came, but the men and their car were gone. Nothing stolen. No real explanation. Just a close call that could have ended a whole lot worse. And here's the part that's always stuck with me, Grandma never forgot how normal that first man looked. No mask. No weapon in sight. Just a friendly enough stranger with a believable excuse. It's the kind of knock most people would have answered without thinking twice. I've got to start by saying, this isn't something I experienced myself. It happened to my grandmother back in the late 1970s, in what was then the outskirts of Detroit, Michigan. Back then, the area was mostly dirt roads, fields, and thick patches of woods. My grandparents' house sat way back off the road on 10 acres of land. To their right, about 200 feet away, was my great-grandparents' place. Beyond that, it was just empty land for half a mile in either direction. My grandpa worked midnight shifts at the auto plant, so my grandma was often home alone at night with her 3 kids. One night, around 11:30, she was in the living room watching TV when there was a knock at the door. She glanced out the window, no car in the driveway, nothing on the road, just moonlight and empty gravel. Now, the way their house was built, the upstairs window sat right over the front step. So instead of going to the door, she went upstairs, slid the window open, and looked down. A man was standing there. He said his car had broken down, just up the road, and asked if he could use her phone to call his girlfriend, who, according to him, lived at the corner. Only, something didn't add up. The spot he described breaking down at was just a couple hundred yards from his girlfriend's house. If that was true, why would he walk half a mile backward, away from her place, to knock on my grandma's door? She told him she couldn't help him. His voice got urgent. Almost pleading. Please, just let me use the phone, I'll be gone in a minute. That's when she heard it, rapid footsteps crunching on gravel, coming from the darkness beside the garage. A split second later, a second man came flying out from the shadows, and hit the ground hard. Out of nowhere, a third figure was on top of him, fists slamming down. The man at the door spun around and bolted into the night. The man on the ground managed to shove his attacker off and ran after him. My grandma's heart was in her throat, she had no idea what she'd just witnessed. It turned out that while she was talking to the men on the porch, another was pressed flat against the side of the house, waiting for her to open the door so they could rush in together. But what they didn't know was that my cousin, home visiting next door, had been sitting at my great-grandma's kitchen table when he saw 2 strangers walking toward my grandma's house. He watched one take position by the garage, saw the other go to the porch, and knew something was wrong. My cousin was a Navy boxing champion. He didn't hesitate. He sprinted over, blindsided the guy hiding by the garage, and knocked him flat. The police came later, but the 2 men, and their vehicle, were gone. The only proof they'd been there. 2 teeth lying in the driveway. My grandma still has them in a little glass bottle. Now, that story might sound like a one-off, but it isn't. Because weird, calculated encounters like that, they still happen. A few months ago, my wife and I got home from a movie and stopped by the neighborhood mailbox to grab a package. Inside was an envelope addressed to me, with no name on the return address, just a street behind ours. The letter inside said, "We are watching you, Mr. Sex Pervert." And it had a picture of two glaring eyes. "We don't know anyone back there. And that street number doesn't even exist." The sheriff came, took the letter, but while they were on their way, both my car alarm and my next-door neighbor's alarm went off at the same time. A neighbor across the street came outside and saw a man in a black car with the lights off, just sitting there. When he stepped toward him, the car sped away, lights still off. Coincidence? Maybe. But when things start happening in clusters, you start sleeping a little less. My grandma's advice still sticks with me. Never assume a knock at your door means someone needs help. Because sometimes, it means someone is already there, waiting, and not alone. I've got to start by saying, this isn't my story. It happened to my grandmother in the late 1970s, out on the edge of Detroit, when the suburbs faded into farmland and woods. Their house sat way back off a dirt road, surrounded by fields. Nearest neighbor was my great-grandparents, 200 feet away. After that, just empty road in both directions. It sounds peaceful now, but it also meant if something happened out there, you were on your own. My grandpa worked midnights at the auto plant, so most nights my grandma was alone with her 3 kids. And one night, a little before midnight, there was a knock at her door. She peered out the window. No headlights. No car in the driveway. Just the moonlit gravel road and the black stretch of trees. The knock came again, louder. Instead of opening the door, she went upstairs and slid open the window that overlooked the porch. A man stood there. He said his car broke down, just up the road, and asked to use her phone to call his girlfriend, supposedly at the corner. But my grandma knew that corner. It was only a couple hundred yards from where he claimed to have broken down. Why would he walk half a mile away from her place instead of straight to his girlfriend's? She told him she couldn't help him. His voice turned urgent, almost desperate. "Please, just let me use the phone, I'll be gone in a minute." And then she heard it. Gravel shifting. Rapid footsteps from the side of the house. A second man came sprinting out of the shadows by the garage, but before he could make it to the porch, another figure lunged out of the dark and tackled him to the ground. The man at the door spun and ran. The one on the ground shoved his attacker off and bolted after him. Both vanished into the tree line. The man who'd blindsided the would-be intruder was my cousin, a Navy boxing champ, home visiting next door. He'd seen the 2 strangers from my great-grandparents' kitchen window, one going to the porch, one hiding by the garage. If he hadn't stepped in when he did, those men would have rushed my grandma the second she opened the door. The police never caught them. The only trace they left: 2 teeth in the driveway, which my grandma kept in a little glass bottle for years. You'd think that'd be the last time something like that happened. But trouble has a way of coming back. Fast forward to years later. My parents had moved into that same house. One night, after everyone was asleep, there was a knock on the door around 1 a.m. My dad looked through the peephole, saw nothing. He opened the door just enough to look out, and there was a man standing off to the side, barely visible in the dark. The guy said his car had broken down and he needed to use the phone. The story was almost word for word what my grandma had heard years earlier. But before my dad could answer, something caught his eye. In the reflection of the living room window, behind the man, was another figure creeping toward the porch steps. Dad slammed the door, locked it, grabbed his shotgun. When he opened it again, both men were gone. A few years ago, something similar happened to me and my wife. We got home from a movie, stopped by the neighborhood mailbox, and found a plain envelope with no name on the return address, just a street number that doesn't even exist. Inside was a note. "We are watching you, Mr. Sex Pervert." Underneath were 2 crudely drawn eyes. "We don't know anyone who lives back there." While we were waiting for the sheriff to come take the letter, my car alarm and my neighbor's went off at the same time. A neighbor across the street stepped outside and saw a black car idling with its lights off. The second he approached, the car sped away into the dark. Here's the thing, these aren't just random events. They feel rehearsed. Like they're part of a pattern. Someone approaches the front door with a story. Another waits where you can't see them. And if you open that door, even a crack, you've already lost. The part that really keeps me up. We never figured out how those men in the 70s knew my grandma was home alone. There were no streetlights. No cars drove by. It's as if they'd been standing out there in the woods, watching. Waiting for the moment she'd be most vulnerable. My grandma always told me. The people you see aren't always the ones you need to be afraid of. Because sometimes, the one you see at your door is just the bait. I need to start by saying, this isn't my story. It happened to my grandmother back in the late 1970s, just outside Detroit, Michigan. And she can tell it like it happened last night. Back then, my grandparents lived way out in the country, dirt roads, wide open fields, and a wall of woods that went on forever. The kind of place where, if someone knocked at your door past sundown, it wasn't a neighbor. One night, around midnight, my grandpa was at work and my grandma was alone with their 3 kids. She was halfway through some late-night TV when she heard 3 knocks on the front door. Now, their house sat far back from the road. If you came down their driveway, you meant to be there. She peeked through the upstairs bedroom window, which overlooked the front porch, and there was a man standing there. No car in the driveway. Northwest headlights on the road. Just him. He looked up at her and said his car had broken down and he needed to use the phone to call his girlfriend, who, conveniently, lived just up the road. But here's the thing. If his story was true, he would have been just a few hundred yards from her house. Instead, he walked half a mile the other way down a pitch-black road to her door. Something felt wrong. She told him she couldn't help and that he needed to move along. That's when his tone changed, from polite to pleading. Please, just let me in for a minute. While she was leaning out the window, telling him to go, she heard it, fast footsteps on the gravel driveway. Out of the darkness, another man lunged toward the porch from beside the garage, except before he could reach the steps, he got slammed to the ground. My grandma froze, watching in shock as the man on the porch turned and bolted into the night. The second man scrambled to his feet, but he wasn't fast enough. The attacker on top of him was my cousin, who happened to be staying at my great-grandma's house next door. He'd been sitting at the kitchen table when he saw 2 men sneaking toward my grandma's place, one taking position by the porch, the other hiding near the garage. They thought they were about to ambush a defenseless woman. They didn't know my cousin was a Navy boxing champion. By the time the second man escaped, he'd left 2 teeth on the gravel, which my grandma still keeps in a little glass bottle to this day. The police came, but the men were never found. Years later, I thought of that night when something strange happened to me. Different time, different place, but the same feeling that something was circling me in the dark. My wife and I had just come home from a late movie. We live in a quiet, middle-class neighborhood. Safe. Or so we thought. I checked our mailbox at the end of the street and found a plain white envelope with no return name, just a made-up address from the street behind us. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. We are watching you, Mr. Sex Pervert. And under the words, a picture of 2 eyes staring back at me. I was stunned. I'd never been accused of anything in my life. My wife was scared. We called the sheriff. Minutes later, while we waited for a deputy, our car alarm started going off, but when I tried to shut it off with my fob, it wouldn't stop. And then it got stranger. Our next-door neighbor's alarm started blaring too. Then a neighbor across the street came outside and saw a black car sitting in the dark, engine running, lights off. When he approached, the driver tore off with the lights still off, disappearing into the night. The fake address on the envelope. If it existed, it would have been directly behind our house. It's strange how that kind of thing lingers in your head. Because sometimes, it's not a knock at the door. Sometimes it's a letter. Sometimes it's footsteps in the dark. And sometimes, you only realize how much danger you were in, after they're already gone. I need to start by saying, this isn't my story. It happened to my grandmother in the late 1970s, just outside Detroit, Michigan. And she can tell it with such clarity you'd think it happened last night. Back then, my grandparents lived in what was basically the middle of nowhere. Dirt roads. Open fields. Woods so thick you could get lost in them within a few minutes. If someone knocked at your door at night, they meant to be there, and not always for the right reasons. One cold night, close to midnight, my grandfather was at work on the late shift, leaving my grandma home with their 3 kids. She was watching a movie in the living room when she heard 3 slow knocks on the front door. Her stomach tightened. They had no close neighbors. No reason anyone should be there. She went upstairs to the bedroom window that overlooked the porch. And there he was, a man in a brown jacket, standing alone, looking up at her. He said his car had broken down, and he needed to use the phone to call his girlfriend. He claimed she lived just up the road. But here's the thing, my grandma knew the road. She knew everyone who lived on it. And she also knew that if he'd really been heading to his girlfriend's house, he would have passed her driveway, not walked half a mile the wrong way through total darkness. She told him to leave. But he didn't move. Instead, his voice got more desperate. "Please, it's cold out here. Just let me in for a minute." While she argued from the window, she heard it, fast, deliberate footsteps on the gravel driveway. Another man emerged from the shadows near the garage, moving toward the porch in a crouched run. Before my grandma could even process it, someone came charging from the side yard and slammed the second man to the ground. The guy on the porch bolted into the darkness. The one on the driveway fought back, but he wasn't fast enough. The attacker was my cousin, only 20 at the time, built like a wall, and fresh out of the Navy where he'd been a boxing champ. He'd been at my great-grandma's next door and saw both men sneaking up, one toward the porch, the other hiding near the garage. They'd been planning to corner her. They didn't know they were being watched. By the time the second man escaped, he'd left 2 teeth on the gravel. My grandma keeps them in a glass bottle to this day, as a reminder of how close it came. Police came, searched the road, but never found them. No cars. No footprints in the snow past the driveway. Almost like they'd vanished. Years later, I couldn't help thinking of that night when something strange happened to me. Different time, different place, but the same crawling feeling. It was the summer of 2004. My wife and I had just moved into a quiet suburban neighborhood. Safe. Or so we thought. One evening, I checked our mailbox and found a plain white envelope with no return name, just an address from the street behind ours. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. "We are watching you, Mr. Sex Pervert." And under the words, a picture of 2 wide, unblinking eyes. I froze. I'd never been accused of anything like that in my life. My wife was shaken. We called the sheriff. Minutes later, while we waited, my car alarm started going off in the driveway, but my remote wouldn't shut it off. Then the neighbor's alarm started screaming. Then another neighbor's. Someone was setting them off. Across the street, a neighbor spotted a black car parked in the dark, engine running, lights off. When he walked toward it, the driver sped away without turning the headlights on. That fake address on the envelope. If it existed, it would have been directly behind our backyard. I thought that was the end of it, until a few months later. It was 3 a.m. on a rainy night when we were woken by knocking. Slow. Deliberate. I opened the door just a crack, and there was a man I'd never seen before, soaking wet, smiling like he knew me. "Hey," he said, "I think my buddy used to live here. Mind if I come in for a second?" Every hair on my arm stood on end. I told him no. He kept smiling. And then, without breaking eye contact, he looked past me, into the house. It felt like he was counting. Measuring. I slammed the door, locked it, and called 911. By the time the cops came, he was gone. It's strange how this stuff follows you. My grandma says danger is like a shadow, once it finds you, it tends to stick close. And sometimes, it knocks. Sometimes, it leaves a letter. Sometimes, it just stands outside in the rain, waiting for you to open the door.